First of all, I want to thank President Gagne for his warm welcome. And Nestor, of course, everybody knows. And I just want to, before I start, express my gratitude to Nestor and to Gina for their initiative and hard work and creativity and just persistence in putting this together. Totally unique conference. So I thank them, and I'm sure that I express the sentiments of everybody here. So thank you, Gina and Nestor. When I was working on this talk, somewhere like 3 o'clock in the morning, I was reminded of a phrase that Milgram used in one of his last published articles, which appeared in New Ideas in Psychology. It was basically a critique of a theoretical conceptual article which he didn't think much of. And as you may know, among his repertoire of humorous statements, there was the sarcastic end of it. And that's how he commented on this article, which he did not like at all. And he ended up, his critique was something like, I'm left wondering whether what I just read was grand or simply grandiose. Well, by the end of my talk, you'll be in a position to make that judgment as well. Anyway, it is now, we're marking the 50th year of the anniversary of the publication of Milgram's first article, 1963, on the obedience research. And what I thought I'd do is look back and explore the wide and diverse landscape of the contemporary influence and relevance of the obedience experiments. And then, having done that, I want to speculate as to why is it? What is the source of this wide-ranging interest in the work? It's speculation, but it's speculation that's supported by some modest evidence. Anyway, let me start by noting some practical applications of the experiments. Milgram's discovery about the unexpectedly powerful human tendency to obey authorities can be applied to real life in a number of different ways. First, it provides a reference point for certain phenomena that on the face of it strain our understanding, thereby making them more plausible. For example, the Canadian province of Quebec, in an effort to reduce medication errors, has paid pharmacists for reporting and refusing to fill erroneous prescriptions which could pose a danger to the patient. Yet, only a fraction of the pharmacists have made use of this process, presumably because it involves filing a report that can be seen by the prescribing physician, and the pharmacists are reluctant to confront and question his or her authority. In a different realm, Milgram's findings can help us fathom how it was possible for managers of fast food restaurants to fall for a bizarre hoax over 70 times between 1995 and 2004 all across the USA. 70 times, over 70 times. Now, of course, we don't know how many people turned them down, turned down the hoaxer, but 70, whatever the other side of it is still quite hefty. Anyway, the best known of these hoaxes, and probably the most horrific case, took place at McDonald's outside of Louisville, Kentucky in April 2004. An assistant manager got a call from a pseudo-policeman calling himself Officer Scott, telling her that a teenage employee had been accused of stealing a purse. He ordered the assistant manager to strip search the employee, which she did, in the restaurant's office that happened to be monitored by surveillance camera. Per Officer Scott's instructions, the employee was stripped, made to jump up and down, supposedly to shake loose the money, and to strike humiliating poses. When the assistant manager had to go back into the store, she called her boyfriend to take over. He continued to carry out degrading instructions from the caller, which included sexual abuse of the girl. The probable perpetrator was caught, but was acquitted because only circumstantial evidence was available. I say probable because even though he was acquitted, the hoaxes stopped came to a death stop after he was arrested. So anyway, the teenage victim sued McDonald's and was awarded by the court, was awarded $6 million. A recent movie titled Compliance, how many of you have seen it? So you know what I'm talking about, probably more than I am because I haven't seen it. But what I do know is that when it was first shown at the Sundance Film Festival, it created a massive outrage in the audience. It was based on the strip search cases. If you go back a few years before then, an episode of Law & Order Special Victims Unit, also modeled after the strip search cases, Robin Williams put on a spooky performance as the pseudo-policeman who the show's writers, displaying a wicked sense of humor, gave the name Detective Milgram. Scholars of the Holocaust have shown an interest in obedience studies. More specifically, Milgram's work has informed debate on the Holocaust, providing support for one approach consistent with Hannah Arendt's banality of evil perspectives to explain the behavior of the Nazi killers and their allies. Thus, Milgram's work has at times been referred to by historians and other scholars of the Holocaust, including the foremost historian of the era, Raoul Hilberg. An example is a book by historian Christopher Browning titled Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and The Final Solution in Poland, that title of the book. It's about a Nazi mobile utility unit that roamed the Polish countryside between 1942 and 1943, killing 38,000 Jews in cold blood at the behest of their commanders. Browning makes a detailed comparison between the behavior of members of Battalion 101 and the actions of Milgram's subjects, noting that, quote, many of Milgram's insights and graphic confirmation in the behavior and find graphic confirmation in the behavior and testimony of the men of the Reserve Police Battalion 101. And we can find the following quote in a book review of Daniel Goldhagen's controversial book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which appeared in the Washington Post. The reviewer wrote as follows: Daniel Goldhagen now claims he deserves a place alongside Hannah Arendt, Stanley Milgram, Raoul Hilberg, and Yehuda Bauer, the great fathomers of the Holocaust. My own perspective is that the obedience experiments do not explain the whole range of horrors that constitute the Holocaust. If you look back at the very beginning of Milgram's book, Obedience, Authority, and External View, you come across the following statement. He wrote as follows: this is perhaps the most fundamental lesson of our study. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a destructive process, end quote. The obedience experiments, I believe, speak to the behavior of, say, the dutiful train conductor who transported thousands of Jews to Auschwitz with the same degree of routinization as he might to deliver bushels of apples from one German city to another. But I don't think you can apply the obedience experiments to the inventive cruelties devised by the concentration camp guards and others to torture and murder their victims. Clearly, Milgram's phrase, without any particular hostility on their part, doesn't apply to them. Their murderous brutality and destructiveness must have come from within. Second, to continue with practical applications, in his obedience studies, Milgram obtained a rare kind of finding. One, that people can apply to themselves to change their behavior, or at least to gain a deeper understanding, deeper insight into themselves. Countless people who have learned about the obedience research have been better able to stand up against arbitrary or unjust authority. At a memorial gathering from Milgram, the year after he died, he died in 1984, the memorial meeting was 1985, a former student from Latin America told the audience that those opposing dictatorships drew strength from Milgram's research, giving them the courage to resist tyranny. Harold Takushian, who got his doctorate from Milgram, told me that at his very first academic position, the dean wanted him to do something that was immoral. At this point, he was still an untenured assistant professor. Despite his vulnerability, he turned the dean down, an action that he attributes to having learned about the obedience experiments. And a participant in a version of the obedience experiments conducted in Minnesota wrote Milgram to thank him for making a major contribution to my understanding of myself. I'm quoting from him to continue his quote, I think I hold my values about proper human behavior more deeply than I did before the experiment, but I also realized they would have to be very deeply rooted to prevail against the subtle force of authority, end quote. The third application of Milgram's research is that it suggests specific preventive actions people can take to resist unwanted pressures from authorities. And these preventive actions, I've distilled these from the obedience studies and related research. First, question the authorities' legitimacy. We often give too wide a berth to people who project a commanding presence either by their demeanor or by their mode of dress, and follow their orders even in contexts irrelevant to their authority. Am I making that banging sound, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what can I do to prevent
Well, put your paper up a little, Paul.
Just move the mic.
Tom, when you're hitting the
Yeah.
mic, every time you look
Against
down,
it?
so you need to lift, maybe, yeah, lift your notes up. Yeah, lift your notes up. Can you lift your notes up?
Okay, I'll try that.
Move the mic down, yeah.
Okay, again, we're talking about the suggestions from Milgram's research about how to resist unwanted pressures from authorities. First, question the authorities' legitimacy. We often give too wide a berth to people who project a commanding presence either by their demeanor or by their mode of dress, and follow their orders even in contexts irrelevant to their authority. For example, one study by Brad Bushman, who by the way is a former student of Sharon Presley. Sharon, are you here? She was on the program. Found that wearing a fireman's uniform significantly increased a person's persuasive powers to get a passerby to give change to another person so he could feed a parking meter. Even outside of his accustomed role and usual relevant domain of expertise, he possessed greater social power than a person wearing a business suit or one dressed casually. Of greater consequence was this tactic of questioning an authority's legitimacy used in a notorious Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq by a Navy dog handler named William Kimbrough, whose job was to find drugs. One day he was told by a superior officer to use the dogs to scare the daylights out of some prisoners. He refused, successfully, by questioning the officer's right, namely his legitimacy, to give him this order. He said, essentially, my job is to use the dogs to find drugs, nothing else. And he managed to get out of the odious assignment. Second, when instructed to carry out an act, you find abhorrent. Even when the demand comes from a legitimate authority, stop and ask yourself, is this something I would do on my own initiative? The answer may well be no, because according to Milgram, moral considerations play a role in acts carried out under one's own steam, but not when they emanate from an authority's commands. Third, don't even start to comply with commands that you feel even slightly uneasy about. Acquiescence to commands of an authority that are only mildly objectionable is in Milgram's experiments, the beginning of a step-by-step escalating process of entrapment. The farther one moves along the continuum of increasingly destructive acts, the harder it is to extract oneself from the commanding authority's grip, because to do so is to confront the fact that the earlier acts of compliance were wrong. In fact, a content analysis of experiment-subject dialogue in one of Milgram's experiment conditions conducted by Modigliani and Rochat showed that the earlier the subject started questioning or resisting the experimenter, more likely he would end up defying the experimenter. Fourth, if you're part of a group that has been commanded to carry out immoral orders, find an ally in the group who shares your perceptions and is willing to join you in opposing the objectionable commands. It is tremendously difficult to be a lone dissenter, not only because of the strong human need to belong, but also because via the process of pluralistic ignorance, the compliance of others makes the action seem acceptable, and leads you to question your own negative judgment. In one of Milgram's conditions, which he aptly called the liberating effects of group pressure, the naive subject was one of a three-person teaching team. The other two were actually Confederates who one after another refused to continue shocking the victim. Their defiance had a liberating influence on the subject, so that only 10% of them ended up giving the maximum shock. Reflecting on this powerful antidote to repressive authority, Milgram concluded, quote, "The mutual support provided by men for each other is the strongest bulwark we have against the excesses of authority," end quote. By the way, the aversion to being alone dissenter seems to apply even to people of high status. A recent archival analysis of Supreme Court decisions across a 50-year period by Granberg and Bartels looked at the frequency of the different majority versus minority configurations. They found that the least frequent pattern was an 8-to-1 decision, occurring in only 10% of the cases. There may be other reasons why that happened, but certainly it's consistent with this notion of having an aversion to being the lone dissenter. Over the years, as I've come across the various instances of the impact and influence of the obedience experiments, I noticed that they comprise a continuum from serious and consequential at one end to the silly or trivial at the other end, and with points in between. Let me start with the serious end. There are two instances I want to talk about. The first is the increasing use of the obedience experiments by legal scholars and practitioners. A few years ago, at the National Conference on Professional Responsibility organized by the American Bar Association, one panel titled, quote, Unethical Obedience by Subordinate Lawyers, Practical Lessons from Social Psychology, end quote. What it did is discuss the problem of serious members of law firms directing subordinates to carry out unethical actions. It was organized and chaired by Andrew Perlman, who is, are you there? Howdy, Andy. He organized a conference, and he's a professor at Suffolk University Law School. He was kind enough to invite me to participate in that panel. The third panelist was John Hanson, a legal scholar at Harvard Law School. My recollection is that one way or another, each of us drew on the obedience experiments in our presentations. If you go to the monster-sized database, LexisNexis, click on law reviews and put in Milgram and obedience, you will come up with 396 hits. As evidenced by the magnitude of this yield law, it's clearly the discipline outside of psychology that makes the greatest use of the obedience studies. While many of the references to the obedience experiments pulled up by LexisNexis are perfunctory or minimal, some are quite important. Let me give you an example. Stephen Hartwell, a law professor at the University of San Diego, has conducted an educational exercise with his students in which they were to individually advise litigants in a small claims court. He told his students that he would be available in an adjacent office if they needed to consult with him. Hartwell writes, and I quote, "The clients were in fact a single Confederate who sought the same advice from each student, how she should present her side of a rent dispute. I told each student to advise the client to lie under oath, that she had paid the rent. When students asked for clarification, I uniformly responded, my advice is that if your client wants to win her case, then you must tell her to perjure herself," end quote. And then he says, continues, "We wanted them to experience the pull between loyalty and authority and prescribed loyalty to authority and prescribed ethical conduct." Now there were 24 students there. Although many of the 24 participating students grumbled either to me or to the client about my advice, 23 told the client to perjure herself. A final example of the use of obedience studies in the legal realm is based on my personal experience. In October 2007, I received a phone call from Amanda Lee, a Seattle lawyer, who was defense counsel for a young Army Ranger named Alex Blum. He had been charged with participating in an armed bank robbery in Washington State. At an early age, Alex knew he wanted to serve his country in one of the most elite Milgram military regiments, the Airborne Army Rangers. You guess the other one. As soon as he was old enough, he enlisted. Besides an impossibly grueling basic training, he went through the Ranger Indoctrination Program, which among other things stresses unconditional obedience to one's commander. The last step toward becoming a full-fledged Ranger is serving a stint in Afghanistan or Iraq. Well, while he's waiting at the Army base to get his orders to be shipped out, he was approached by a Ranger commander named Luke Sommer to help him rob a bank near Tacoma. Alex agreed, and soon he was driving Sommer and two of his buddies to the bank. He dropped them off, and they entered the bank brandishing rifles, wearing masks and body armor. Alex, meanwhile, circled around the back and with military precision picked them up as they were running out of the bank. They managed to get about $50,000, and luckily nobody was shot. As they were driving away, a passerby wrote down Alex's license plate number, and within a couple of days he was arrested by the police, and he confessed immediately. His defense lawyer asked for my help in obtaining a lenient sentence for Alex, because there's a whole range of possible sentences for this kind of crime. After looking through the materials in Alex's file, such as FBI reports and dozens of individual testimonials from friends, relatives, and employers, I agreed to try. Meanwhile, Luke Sommer, who was a dual Canadian-American citizen, managed to get back home to British Columbia, and he was fighting extradition. The court could not have a sentencing hearing before he was brought back. Since it was uncertain as to when that would happen, the defense team decided to ask the court to release Alex pending the sentencing hearing. He had already been sitting in jail at that time for about 16 months. His lawyer asked that I prepare a declaration to the judge arguing for leniency for Alex to be used at that time to support his release pending sentencing, and then later again for the judge to consider at a sentencing hearing. I argued in the declaration, among other things, that obedience tendencies should be considered a mitigating factor. I began the declaration by giving a detailed description of the obedience experiments and then applied them to Alex's situation. I would like to quote briefly, if I may, from the declaration. We are used to thinking that there's a direct line between our inner qualities, the kind of persons we are, and the nature of our actions. Good people do commendable things and bad people do undesirable things. Milgram showed that external social pressures, especially those emanating from higher authorities, can be powerful determinants of our actions, and that humans need not be innately evil or immoral to act in reprehensible ways. So, an understanding of Alex Blum's criminal behavior must start with what he has in common with most people, as demonstrated by Milgram. That an extreme readiness to follow legitimate authorities and act in ways he would not under his own steam is part of human nature. And I should note, I added parenthetically, it is important that we clearly distinguish between explaining and excusing. To say that an important cause of a person's behavior emanates from external pressures, in particular those originating from authorities, does not excuse or remove culpability. As long as no coercive, punitive force is present, a person has a choice. And indeed, 35% of Milgram's subjects chose to defy the experimenter in spite of the experimenter's commands. To get back to the main argument, and so, simply as part of human nature, Alex Blum was primed to obey Luke Sommer, his supervisor, whom he clearly considered a legitimate authority. Alex's intensive training and indoctrination as a ranger, in which his unquestioned reflexive obedience was a key element, magnified his normal readiness to obey, which Milgram enlightened us about. Alex's numerous character references point to a caring, dependable, and honorable young man who was looked up to by his siblings and friends, and whose main goal in life was to serve his country in the elite Rangers. He clearly would never have conceived of robbing a bank on his own. The fact that his commander, Luke Sommer, took advantage of the unquestioning obedience that Alex was taught as a ranger and perverted it to aid his criminal venture merits consideration as a mitigating factor in judging Alex's actions. That was the end of my piece from a longer statement for the judge. Anyway, my declaration helped obey Alex's release. The judge ruled that he would be released to live at home in Colorado on condition that he work and go to school. His parents would have to post a property bond, meaning that if Alex ran away, they could lose their home. The family was ecstatic, and what was most gratifying to me was a beautiful thank you note from Alex's father. When the sentencing hearing was finally held about a year and a half later, the defense team integrated part of my declaration into their presentation to the judge. The end result, Alex received a very light sentence, time served plus 8 months of home detention with work and school release, plus 2,000 hours of community service. Of course, what remained unchanged was his dishonorable discharge and the loss of his life's dream of becoming an Army Ranger. The second kind of impact of serious nature I want to mention involves the U.S. Army, which has taken the lessons of Milgram's research to heart and acted upon it. When I was writing Milgram's biography, I interviewed a military psychologist named Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. And he's written about battle and the rather starkly written books about war. Anyway, I interviewed him, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, and asked him if Milgram's work has had any discernible impact on the military. He said, certainly. He told me that when he was undergoing officer training, they were shown training films instructing soldiers on how to disobey illegitimate orders. He described this to me as a true revolution in military history, which he said is directly traceable to Milgram and the massacre of civilians by U.S. soldiers in My Lai. Shifting gears now, I want to point to the impact of the obedience experiments in the realms of theater, fiction, film, and music. Early on in 1973, Welsh poet and writer Danny Apsey produced a play, Dogs of Pavlov, based on the obedience experiments. The script was published in book form, and Apsey's introduction to it consisted largely of a scathing critique of the ethics of the obedience experiments. Quote, many may feel, he wrote, that, quote, that in order to demonstrate the subjects may behave like so many Eichmanns, the experimenter had to act the part to some extent of a Himmler, end quote. Apsey gave Milgram the opportunity to write 2 responses, one after reading the introduction, then another one after he had actually read the play. Milgram defended the ethics of the obedience experiments by drawing a parallel between drama and experiments. He wrote, quote, I do feel that you're excessively harsh in your language when condemning my use of illusion in the experiment. As a dramatist, you surely understand that illusion may serve a revelatory function, and indeed, the very possibility of theater is founded on the benign use of contrivance, end quote. Consistent with that defense is a statement Milgram once made in a letter to Alan Elms, his student, former student. Here's what he wrote, good experiments, like good drama, embody verities. Since then, I've come across about half a dozen theatrical productions connected to the obedience experiments. A very recent one was a very clever off-Broadway multimedia performance titled The Answer is Horace. And by the way, there'll be extra credit afterwards that somebody can tell me where that comes from. The answer is Horace. Everybody here should know, right? Okay. A few years ago, Canadian author Eileen Coughlin came out with a page-turner of a murder mystery called Dying by Degrees, which is centered on a deadly version of the obedience experiment. More recently, a tragic comic novel called The Learners was written by a graphic artist named Chip Kidd. It takes place in New Haven, and Milgram makes an appearance in the book. The central character works for an ad agency, and one day he receives a phone call from Milgram asking for help in producing a display ad to recruit subjects for the obedience experiments. And just as I was preparing this talk, by coincidence or not, I received a copy of a novel called Deutschland, written by British author Martin Wagner. One whole chapter consists of an almost verbatim transposition of the dialogue between the experimenter and the last subject, Fred Prosy, depicted in the Milgram film, Obedience, integrated into the book's plotline. But 95% of it is verbatim, but sort of modified slightly with the names to fit in. Turning now to film or video other than Milgram's own films, in 1976 CBS aired a TV movie titled The 10th Level, a dramatization of the obedience experiments and events surrounding them, starring William Shatner as the Milgram-esque character. According to George Belloc, the film's writer, making the film met with some resistance. For example, one TV executive called it godless. Milgram wrote a childhood friend, this was the day after it was shown on TV, quote, "There's a genuine human drama underlying the obedience problem that got lost in the welter of video cliches," end quote. Obviously he didn't like it. Although it had a heavy overlay of fiction, Belloc received honorable mention at APA's 1977 National Media Awards, quote, "for increasing the public's knowledge and understanding of psychology," end quote. Ikobe Kar, or in English, that's French, in English, I as in Icarus, which appeared in 1979, is a thriller about a political assassination produced by Henri Verneuil, a successful French filmmaker, and starred Yves Montand. Verneuil created it to serve as a vehicle for presenting Milgram's obedience experiments to the French public. It turns out that the accused killer had been a subject, believe it or not, a subject in a Milgram-type experiment, and the dramatic high point of the film is a gripping 20-minute segment depicting a subject going through the experiment at the University of Leia, L-E-Y-A. What is that a scrambled version of? Yale. Thank you, Yale. So you see the connection is made more and more explicit. Okay, there are two recent documentaries that contain footage from the obedience film as a way of drawing parallels between the experiment and the misdeeds or atrocities depicted in the films. One is called The Smile Disguise in the Room, about the Enron corporate fraud, and the other is called The Ghosts of Abu Ghraib. As noted earlier, the first movie about the obedience experiments was shown on TV, The 10th Level. We currently seem to be coming full circle as television is once again becoming an important medium for presentations related to the obedience experiments. In May 2009, the BBC showed a documentary titled How Violent Are You? As part of its Horizon Science series. One of its segments was a replication of the obedience experiment. Clifford Stott, who is with us, are you with us here? Good to see you. Was with us here, was involved in that replication. Undoubtedly, we will hear more about it directly from him. In October 2011, the Discovery Channel showed a program titled How Evil Are You?, hosted by horror filmmaker Eli Roth. It was largely a recreation of Jerry Berger's modified replication and involved Jerry Berger conducting the experiment again. In an interview, Roth said it was, quote, "the most disturbing thing I ever watched. It's pretty unbelievable to watch people go through it. I thought fewer people would do it. That was what made it so disturbing, how people just kept going." In March 2010, a film, The Game of Death, was shown on French TV. It was an adaptation of the obedience experiment placed within the framework of a fake game show. It got a massive amount of public attention and created controversy. There were some important differences between it and the original obedience experiments, but the producers tried to make the connection explicit by juxtaposing parts of it with segments of the black and white obedience film, bringing the original experiments to the attention of a large viewing audience. In an album produced in 1986, rock musician Peter Gabriel had a song titled We Do What We're Told, paren, Milgram's 37, close paren. When I saw the title, I thought I knew what the 37 referred to. In the archives, I saw correspondence indicating that Gabriel was a serious admirer of Milgram. As such, I assumed that he would have read Obedience to Authority and Experimental View, which, as you know, contains descriptions of almost all the experimental variations and their results. The last one described was Experiment 18, a peer-administered shocks. In this condition, the shocks were administered by a confederate. The real subject simply helped out with subsidiary acts. The results, 37 out of 40, went along with the procedure till the maximum shock. So I thought, hey, this was 37 that Gabriel's song referred to, and I posted this information on my Milgram website. However, it turns out I was wrong. In a few weeks, I got emails, repressed, angry emails from two rabid fans of Peter Gabriel who had attended his concerts, where Gabriel explained that the 37 research, get this, 37 refer to the percentage of subjects who were defiant in the voice feedback condition, which, as you know, the obedience rate was 62.5, so we kind of rounded it off. Okay, a couple of other musical connections. There's a French-German punk rock group named Milgram, and the name of their album is 450 Volt. Don't ask me why. There's no evidence on jacket and inside why they named it. I guess they were just fascinated by the name. And more recently, a folk singer, Dar Williams, recorded an album containing a song titled Buzzer, written from the point of view of a participant in Milgram's obedience experiments. So we have examined the wide-ranging impact of the obedience experiments on contemporary culture and thought. Over the years, as I've kept discovering more and increasingly diverse uses of the obedience experiments, I would occasionally ask myself, why have these experiments had such wide appeal and influence? I finally concluded that it likely has to do with the fact that in his demonstration of our powerful propensity to obey authority, Milgram has identified one of the universals of social behavior transcending both time and place, and people intuitively sense this. I've carried out two data analyses that provide at least some modest evidence for the stability of rates of obedience across time and place. In one analysis, I evaluated the relationship between results of both Milgram's standard obedience experiments and replications conducted by others, and their dates of publication. There was absolutely no association between when a study was conducted, and the amount of obedience it yielded. The correlation coefficient hovered near zero. In a second analysis, I again took all of Milgram's standard conditions and replications conducted by others and compared the outcomes of the study conducted in the United States with those of studies conducted in other countries. Remarkably, the average obedience rates were very similar. In the U.S. studies, on average, 61% of the subjects were fully obedient, and elsewhere, the obedience rate was 66%. A one-way analysis of variance showed that those averages were not significantly different from each other. And I believe that Jerry Berger's results in his modified replication obtaining the same obedience rate as Milgram 45 years later, despite substantive differences in the range of the shock continuum, the use of a more ethnically diverse group of subjects comprising a wider age span, demonstrated the resilience and constancy of obedience tendencies and served to strengthen my universality argument. In concluding, I would be remiss if I didn't share with you a current development that represents a quantum leap in the diffusion of knowledge about the obedience experiments. Scott Klaus, a professor of social psychology at Wesleyan University, has been teaching social psychology, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, as a MOOC, which stands for Massive Open Online Course, through Coursera.org this summer, as we speak, or as we spoke. Many of you may be familiar with him as the founder of the Social Psychology Network, which is one of the largest internet sites devoted to psychological research and teaching. Coursera.org offers courses free of charge by top people in their field to students throughout the world, most of whom could not afford traditional higher education. The only requirement is to have an internet connection. To assist with the teaching and to enrich the course, various publishers and organizations have provided free access to their products. For example, McGraw-Hill has made some chapters from Meyer's social psychology textbook freely available. ABC News gave Scott permission to use excerpts from their 2007 primetime program featuring Jerry Berger's modified replication without charge, while APA has granted him free use of Berger's American Psychologist article reporting the replication, and Mrs. Milgram has allowed use of segments from Milgram's classic obedience film as well as his other films, such as Human Aggression Gratis. A MOOC is a technically ingenious concept. Lecture material is presented in small chunks, followed by testing and feedback. Students have to answer each question correctly before they can go on to the next lecture. Bootlegging of video materials is prevented by presenting them at a lower resolution than a DVD or videotape. Students successfully complete a course, get a certificate attesting to that. And here's the clincher. The enrollment for the course has been truly incredible. As of July 2nd, this past July 2nd, it had over 136,000 registrants. Students come from nearly 200 countries, over 75% from outside of the United States. So we have a situation where the course clearly is helping bring Millicent's work to a global audience. Scott believes that it should help students resist malevolent authority. Given the cases I mentioned where this has happened, this is not an unrealistic goal. Furthermore, with such a huge audience, we may well yet hear of the effects we have not yet even thought of. After 50 years, it still remains the prime example of creative experimental realism used in the service of a question of deep social and moral significance. It has been without parallel in social psychology and perhaps psychology as a whole as a catalyst of productive scholarly and public debate. And I think that's why we're all here. Thank you.